to object to proposed rules and suspend existing rules. It's on the list along with, again, absence of statutory authority, emergencies relating to public health, safety, and welfare, failure to comply with legislative intent, conflict with state law, and change in circumstances since the enactment of the law upon which the rule is based. Arbitrariness and capriciousness is also a term that arises in a context of judicial review. It's generally that's the quoted material that Mr. Hirschman provided earlier is where that comes from. And I think it's important to note that the standards, the courts have not evaluated the standards by which JCRR reaches its conclusions. And in fact, the practice of the committees quite likely, in fact, that the court would distinguish use of that phrase in the JCRR context from how it's used in a judicial setting. So, in essence, it's up to the committee, to decide and what those terms mean, and if the members are, finding that the agency's actions were unreasonable, those are the terms, the way in which that term is used in a judicial context. So drawing from that, if the committee members have similar conclusions, that would be a grounds by which they can object or suspend.
Just to add to that, I believe April 29th, 2020, the Senate Committee on Public Benefits, Licensing, and State-Federal Relations objected to the Rule 3.2 on those grounds, which is what referred into JCRR.
So that's why it's in the motion for this committee?
Senator Stroll, I know you're the chair of that. Did you have anything to add on that? Or
Can someone explain to me why you believe it to be arbitrary and capricious?
Well, I know Senator Stroll had talked about that earlier, right? I mean, I think that, Senator Stroll had made his case, and I think that in this discussion, I think amongst all of the viewpoints you've heard, I think is geared towards that angle.
It doesn't answer my question.
It really doesn't.
I'm sorry.
I'm looking for context about what specifically makes this arbitrary and capricious in relation to the examining board creating this rule. How is that arbitrary and capricious?
Well, the belief is that it's outside of the legislative intent, and we're here to debate that and to have that discussion now, which you've heard many different perspectives as to why that could be. So I mean, that's part of this whole hearing has been discussing our objections towards it. I think people have been clear about where they're coming from, so I'm not sure what else to add.
Oh, clearly, thank you.
Senator Larson.
Mr. Chair, I'm just trying to help our new committee member here to answer the question. If Leg Council could define legislative intent as it pertains to conversion therapy, as what guidance has come through the legislature regarding conversion therapy, maybe that'll help guide us.
Again, the list of reasons for which JCRR can object or suspend a rule, I think best categorized as ranging in from on a spectrum from objective to subjective. And again, this committee is authorized by statute to vote to suspend a rule if it believes that among those reasons that a rule fails to comply with legislative intent. I think earlier Senator Noss made the point that the rule, in his opinion, seemed to depart from other types of unprofessional conduct, and therefore he expressed the opinion that it was not what the legislature intended when granting the authority to regulate unprofessional conduct. That would be an example of how what legislative intent means.
And again, if we want to, I just want to point out that in the exec session, we can discuss that motion language if people want to discuss that at this point, we have a lot of people that are here to
For sure.
testify, so maybe we move past that and table that conversation until the exec session, if people still want to discuss the motion language.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may, just to make sure that we're pinning this down, just as Ledge Council kind of, I just want to make sure that you're clear that there is no explicit legislative intent when it comes to conversion therapy. Your interpretation talked about the ability, as Ledge Council, your interpretation of what JCR-AR can object to. But you specifically said the opinion of one of the committee members and his opinion about whether it is legislative intent, not whether it is explicit legislative intent. Is that correct? There is no explicit legislative intent outlined because legislature has not acted either in the affirmative or in the negative when it comes to conversion therapy.
The term isn't defined in chapter 227. If you're, interested in drawing analogies from the judicial context, failure of legislation to pass is a relatively weak form of when legislative intent is cited by courts. They're usually citing things more specific than failure of a particular piece of legislation to pass.
Thank you. I just want to note, as we are now on a very, very, very tight rope as far as, I think you said, a very weak argument. And just to make that tightrope even weaker, I think it's important to make sure that people who are listening and people who are paying attention to this, that there was 2 different bills that both failed to be acted on this last cycle. So if there is an argument of saying, and again for our new committee members, if there's an argument that some folks might be saying that the legislative intent is clear because we didn't act on a bill that was supposed to ban conversion therapy, we also failed to act on a bill that was put forward by this committee that would have clarified the language. And so therefore, the legislative intent, as I mentioned earlier, you could pull it in both directions. You could have an argument in both pockets on this one of saying this is what the legislative intent is. And so what is happening, so that is a weak argument. It is one that has no, that's very weak to stand on. And the only reason we're here, we can talk about this more in executive session, is because the Supreme Court has outlawed, has said that you can't do indefinite suspension of rules. And so therefore there has to be this runaround of introducing a bill and pretending we're gonna act on it but never acting on it. That expired when session ended, and now here we are today, suspending this rule again, going in and saying to a group of professionals, we know better than what is something that's banned by the Psychological Association of America and by most professionals. We know better, and we're gonna put forward a bill, but pretend that we're gonna act on it again. So just giving a
I don't
context of
believe the
what's
Supreme
happening.
Court has ever determined that we can't do permanent objections. Did I miss something on that?
Speaking to the suspension process, the courts have deemed the temporary suspension of emergency rule to be permissive action of the legislature. They have not, the indefinite objection is a new procedure that was created in recent legislative sessions, and it has not been considered by the courts.
Okay, with that, Anthony Lococo will be joining us from Wisconsin. Oh, thank you, Mark, for joining us. Yep. Anthony Lococo with the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, speaking in favor of suspension. Thank you for joining us, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you. As you mentioned, my name is Anthony Lococo. I'm with Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. My testimony will focus on the question of whether the rule under consideration, which labels as unprofessional conduct the expression of certain viewpoints by mental health professionals to their clients, is constitutional under the federal and Wisconsin constitutions. But before I discuss that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what my testimony is not about. My testimony does not call into question the fact that every person seeking counseling on matters relating to sexual orientation and gender identity has inherent dignity and value. Whatever their perspective, their self-perception, their self-identification, their history, or their aspirations, individuals seeking counseling on these topics should be treated with respect and kindness. The issues they raise should be taken seriously rather than dismissed out of hand, and hatred toward anyone must be unequivocally rejected and condemned. Those points are distinct from the legal question of whether it's constitutional for a state agency or board to simply ban certain viewpoints on topics of significant public concern like gender transition in the counselor-patient context. That's the question I'm here to address, and the answer to that question is no, it's not constitutional. My testimony is going to discuss two serious constitutional problems with the rule in question. First, the rule violates the free speech clause of the First Amendment of the federal Constitution. Second, it violates the Wisconsin Constitution's religious liberty guarantees. The clearest and most egregious violation in question is the rule's disregard of black letter law regarding government regulation of speech. Pursuant to the free speech clause, the state has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. Laws attempting to do so are called content-based laws, and content-based laws are presumptively unconstitutional and will receive the strictest judicial review. To be clear, a speech regulation targeted at specific subject matter, like the topic of gender identity, is content-based even if it doesn't discriminate among viewpoints within that subject matter. Governmental discrimination against a particular viewpoint, in contrast, is a more blatant and egregious form of content discrimination that's likewise prohibited. The rule under review here is clearly content-based and even discriminates against viewpoint. For example, counseling aimed at changing behaviors or expressions of self is declared unprofessional, whereas counseling that assists a client who's seeking to undergo a gender transition or counseling that provides a client with acceptance is permitted. So it's misconduct to advise a client that transition is not in their best interest, but it's not misconduct to advise a client that it is in their best interest. It's misconduct to express the view that marriage is between a man and a woman, but it's not misconduct to express the view that marriage can occur between individuals of the same sex. Obviously, the rule draws distinctions based on the message a speaker conveys, and thus is presumptively, if not automatically, unconstitutional. That's basic First Amendment law. It does not matter that the rule here regulates the speech of professionals. In 2018, the Supreme Court of the United States explained that it had never recognized professional speech as a separate category of speech and declined to treat professional speech as a unique category that's exempt from ordinary First Amendment principles. When it said that, it cited cases involving so-called conversion therapy. It emphasized the danger of content-based regulations in the fields of medicine and public health, where information can save lives, adding that throughout history, governments have manipulated the content of doctor-patient discourse to increase state power and suppress minorities. In short, professionals might have a host of good faith disagreements, both with each other and with the government on many topics in their respective fields, and the Supreme Court has indicated that the government's role is to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas in which truth will ultimately prevail. This rule does not do that. So regardless of the fact that the rule regulates the speech of professionals, it would be subject to the most stringent form of judicial review known as strict scrutiny. The Supreme Court has said that it's rare that a regulation restricting speech because of its content will ever be permissible. This rule is no exception. In order to justify the rule, the state would have to show that the rule is in pursuit of a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to achieving that end. This rule cannot meet that test. Now, my assumption